Aha! This is Laborc, and it is so nice to have you here. These are the paints you need. Okay, let's start with the skin. I use steel and drab all over the skin surface. The consistency is a little bit thin, but that's okay because the teardrop clothing holds the paint from overflowing the mini. I do some wet blending with catachan flesh on the shadowy parts, adding some wet paint to the already wet layer and then rinse off my brush and blend the two colors on the surface. Once the first coat dries completely, I add the second thin layer to make the color fully opaque. I use waagh flesh on the suit and apply two thin layers for a nice and even coverage. The parts between the suit and the skin became a little bit blurry, so I separated the two surfaces with some black. You can be precise with some thin lines, but I think it's way easier to apply these thick lines, and once they dry, you can go back with the skins and the suit's base tone and reduce the size of the black lines. To make sure the crevices between the teeth stays darker, I covered the denture with catachan flesh. Here I mixed cadian flesh with steel drab and sketched out the highlights on the skin. After that, I used pure cadian fleshtone and reduced the highlight areas. It blends in really easily if I just apply it with thin layers. Remember guys, to always wait for your layers to dry before applying a new coat of paint to have a nice and smooth surface. Like Granny's butt cheek. I highly recommend to keep a hairdryer close to your hobby space or just borrow it from Granny because it will speed up the drying process immensely. For the maximum highlights of the skin, I mix some ice yellow to the cadian flesh and highlight the areas around the head and the face itself. The face has a lot of blisters as well, so try to pick them out one by one with this highlight color. This will add some extra depth and detail to the face. To shade the skin a bit more, I mixed naggaroth with steel drab and glazed over the shadowy parts. Basically, these are the parts that face down. A few thin layers of glazes will do the job and I leave the skin for now. Back to the suit of Doc Ock. I mixed some lime green to the waagh flesh. You see the skin is quite desaturated. I prefer that to under skin tones and overall I like to use desaturated colors for this type of subject. If you look at my Mysterio and my zombie Mysterio, you can see that the alive version is much more saturated than the undead one. When you pick out the colors for a miniature, always plan ahead what would you like to achieve. For example, I knew that the skin will be desaturated, so I need something more saturated for the suit. Saturation and values need to be distributed in a way that works for the miniature and you can express a lot with them. Of course, you can have something totally desaturated and still look great, but the saturated tones will always grab our attention more. Like if you have a nicely painted human skin tone and the mid-tone of that is a cadian flesh, and you have another skin tone with more of an orange mid-tone. It's more likely the orange one going to grab your attention more than a pale tone. So as I said, I wanted to have more saturation on the suit, so I used pure lime green, which is higher in value than the waagh flesh and more saturated, therefore it's a great color for highlights. Obviously the possibilities are nearly endless, but if you feel like you are in a bit of a pickle when it comes to choosing colors, just try to learn a bit more about color theory. Like if you want a nice saturated green, grab a flat saturated green paint and add some yellow to it. It will push the value and will have a warm feel to it. But keep in mind that yellow is not always the answer for everything, okay? You can use brighter greens or even some oranges could work. For the general colors that I'm using, I usually check the character ID card, because most people prefer to paint their minis to the box art. Now to push the values more, I mix some ice yellow to the lime green. Now this will desaturate our beautiful lime green. which is a problem, right? We can't just go higher in value and have the same level of saturation in the color. It will be cool, but the colors doesn't really work like that. So we make a compromise. We will have a higher contrast, but a little bit less saturation on a smaller surface as we reduce the highlight areas. So what can we do to have some saturation over higher value colors? That's right, we glaze black some of the saturated green over these highlights. This will not only help with saturation, but also blends in the new layer of highlight pretty well. To paint the teeth, I use ice yellow. I always try to leave a thin line between each tooth to make them more separated for some extra definition. Now for the pouches and boots, I used black red. That's a desaturated tone but with some red in it. Red is complementary to green. Is this tone complementary to the mid-tone of the suit? Nope, it's not. But you don't have to follow the rules all the time if you just prefer to have a color on the Mini. Take Granny Laborc for example. Is it advice for her to drink some shots after her heart medicine? No, but she will do it anyway. And it makes her happy and very dizzy as well. So sometimes you can play around the rules if you prefer a tone over another. Now for a warmer leather feel, I mix some ochre brown to the black red and highlight the surface. Oh yeah guys, on the character's left side I intentionally leave everything darker. I like to have an OSL effect there. If you don't want to do that, just mirror the highlights from the other side. For the hair, I like to have a more desaturated highlight tone, so I just mix the black red with ice yellow. This highlight should look like a halo on the hair, and I end it in thin lines at the sides. Since one continuous line doesn't look very real on a surface like the hair, I break up the line with the black red. Now with pure ochre brown, I highlight the leather parts. I go around the edges of the pouches and over the right side of the belt. I don't really do much about the parts under his belly because the drop shadow is just too extreme and it wouldn't be visible even if I highlight it, and also that's a natural shadow, so why would I highlight it more? I wanted to add some extra detail to his goggle. I was aiming for an amber orange look, so I covered the lens with parasite brown. Then I painted the thin line at the bottom with ice yellow as a value sketch. After that I glazed some fluorescent orange over the ice yellow layer, pulling the paint from the parasite brown layer to create a nice and smooth blend. Finally with white I add a small dot on the top right corner.
Nice.
Okay guys, make some tea because we are going to be here for a while. I painted the Crisis Protocol version of Doc Ock some time ago, and I remember that blending the highlights on the tentacles was a lot of time. By the way, if any one of you like to have that Doc Ock, message me on Instagram. Anyway, we are going to cut corners with the tentacles because there is no way I'm going to blend the highlights on them, but don't worry, they will look okay. So on the ID card, the character has these almost black light tentacles, so our highlights doesn't need to be big in volume. The most important thing that we treat each and every tentacle as one continuous surface. Don't mind the little gaps between the joints, okay? Use a mix of dark gray and black and apply the highlights as some thick lines. We need nice coverage, so apply multiple layers or thicker coats. After that, I glazed over the tentacles with the previous mix, not because of any blending purpose, but to matte down the finish of my black primer. If you like to just use a matte varnish over the Mini to diffuse those shiny satin parts. Okay, at this stage I sketched the highlights for the OSL effect, so I won't forget about it in the previous step. If you like to skip the OSL, then just apply the same gray as in the previous step. Now with pure London Grey, I reduce the highlight areas on the tentacles. Use a thicker consistency so the paint will have better coverage. These highlights needs to be applied somewhat precisely. These lines should be applied in a 90-degree angle for all the joints. I keep adding more and more highlight sections on the tentacles and go back with the previous grey if my highlights get messy. There is no shame in making mistakes, but there are some if you are aware of them and don't want to fix them. So guys, take breaks when you are painting, have a cookie with Granny, I mean only you eat the cookie because she has diabetes, and you don't buy the sugar-free stuff because it tastes really bad. After that, come back and look at your mini and make sure you keep an eye out for any messy parts on the tentacles. To push the contrast, I use sky gray. Continuous lines all over, and where I want to end the highlight, I just make the line disappear in a thin ending. You can use ice yellow mix with the previous gray, it would work just as fine. So guys, as you see, these highlights didn't receive any blending whatsoever. But they look okay, because the shapes and the placements are right. So they look right on the model. Now to give more crispiness to the details, I blackline between the joints of the tentacle. It's a little bit thinned down black, and I use a brush that has a nice tip. Try to aim for a consistency that flows easily from your brush, but you have nice control over it. I paint the inner part of the claw with white. This is an undercoat, and I apply multiple layers for a nice and even coverage. I wait between the layers to dry, so you might want to do that as well, or I will slap on your tiny hand. Let's grab the airbrush and aim towards our white undercoat and paint the glowing part with fluorescent orange. The consistency is 6 drops of thinner and 1 drop of paint. I guess if I give you guys the ratios in drops as measurement, maybe it's easier to follow. The compressor is set to 3 bar. Small bursts of paint, and always add the thinner first into your airbrush cup, otherwise there will be consequences, because the airbrush will clog and I will slap on your tiny hand. To make the glow more intense, I apply some ice yellow into the center of the glow. To push the contrast more, I reduce the area inside the ice yellow layer and apply some white. Now with word bearers red, I sketch the OSL parts on the character's body. 6 drops of thinner and 2 globs of paint applied from a wet brush. Okay, you know what guys, let's say it's 1.5 part thinner and 1 part paint. Let's not fix something that isn't broken, right? Compressor was set to 3.5 bar. Now with a thin glaze of naggaroth night, I glaze over the shadowy parts of the skin to add some more depth to the shadows and give a nice hue to the skin. I really like purple on under skin, but it works on pale skin tones just as well. The rest of the tutorial is Patreon exclusive. If you like to access that content, you can find a link in the video description. With that, Doc Ock is done and ready for the table. If you like this painting tutorial, please give it a like and leave a comment. A huge thanks to my Patreons who support this kind of videos, with special shout out to Jonathan Rhodes, Cold Blooded Dom Trying to Paint Minis, Jonathan Mosner, One Shop Joe Crafts, Glitchy McCrash, Guillaume Belanger. At Patreon you can find some exclusive content and PDF guides. The link is in the video description. I hope the rest of your day will be as smooth as a granny's butt cheek.